practice and the way that things happened immediately after I'd done my last video. So although I say last week or something like that, it was perhaps a month or so ago. Anyway, here we go. Hello everybody, it's lovely to be back. So, synchronicity is a word coined by the great psychologist Carl Jung that first came to my notice many years ago in the 1970s, when I was sitting in a circle of development with a retired Methodist minister and his wife. The coming of synchronicity into my life brought with it an awareness of my own connection to what may be called psychic power, or a higher mind working through me. Now, not being psychic in the accepted sense, I have realized the importance of being open and aware to words that have transformative power. This can be one word alone, or a few words strung together that cause a resonance within your heart. For those who do not consider themselves psychic in the accepted sense, and that has been me in the past, I now realize that everyone has this ability, this gift of connection that leads to the communion of souls. I have mentioned in a previous storytelling that I learned this from my friend Lynn, a retired Methodist minister, when sitting in a development circle with him, his wife Bina, and Carlo Hiva, the then president of Ventnor Spiritualist Church. Len had a library of interesting books and subscribed to various catalogues. There was no internet or Amazon in those far-off days of the late 70s. And one evening he asked if I would care to look through one he had received from Helios Books. Browsing through this, there was a title that caught my attention. The Lord of the Dance, by Anthony Duncan. I knew nothing about the author, but by coincidence, my daughter Susie had recently been in a school production where she was asked to play Lord of the Dance on the recorder as she led the others of the cast around the stage. On mentioning this coincidence to Len, he replied, "There is no such thing as coincidence. It is when the universe is trying to attract your attention, and it is known as synchronicity." And so began my so-called psychic awareness of the magic in my life. The book arrived. The book arrived, and here it is. The book arrived. And with it, further evidence of synchronicity, when another of those magic moments occurred. Turning to the back cover, I noticed that Helios Books Company was situated at 8 The Square, Toddington. Toddington was a small, insignificant village between Cheltenham and Broadway in Gloucestershire, where I spent my formative years between the ages of 4 and 9 to escape the wartime bombardment threatening the outskirts of London in Loudon, Essex, where I was born. As a child, I attended Sunday school, as did all the village children in those days, at St Andrew's Church, in the square, Toddington, that same square from which Helios Books later ran its business. So, was I being nudged by the universe to take note of this book? Well, at that time I didn't really understand all the hidden wisdom of the words contained within its pages. The author, Anthony Duncan, was the vicar of a church at Hynham near Gloucester, but a vicar of a very different ilk, for he was a mystic who received those eloquent words via a process we would call channeling today. He was a close friend of Gareth Knight, whose books I read at a much later date, when I would understand those words of transformation. It is now, and this was some time ago because I wrote this some time ago, it is now January the 24th, 2023, and yesterday I attended another lecture at the Phoenix Club, run by Dr. Robert Anderson Plymmer, Bob to me, on the subject of gnosis, during which he mentioned that imagination is an important key to altered states of consciousness. The following day, on reading the inside cover of Lord of the Dance, I noticed a chapter entitled Contemplation, and the words, "The use of creative imagination can bring awareness of other states of existence and the spiritual vocation of the soul." Another synchronicity. The universe is definitely on the phone again, and the voice is getting louder. Then, on the morning of February the 4th, exactly a few weeks ago now, it says 1 week there, but it was a few weeks ago now, I opened my journal of Robin's latest received words of transformation, only to read, "Imagination is the masterpiece to the inner world." Now I am being shouted at. Firstly by Bob, secondly from Beyond the Grave by Anthony Duncan, and thirdly through Robin. The source of the universe is on the line again. Going to my bookcase, I was led to pick up Christ and the Kabbalah by Gareth Knight and Anthony Duncan. And today I'm going to share some of my most recent magic, so you may also recognize when the magic is happening in your life. Following on from my last storytelling that mentioned the synchronicities that occurred while I was preparing that episode, I feel inspired to speak of those that happened immediately afterwards. Not having the gift of the clairs, so eloquent in my friends, synchronicity became my own personal way of recognizing when the universe required my attention. Recently, when listening to Daniel List, also known as Dark Journalist, he mentioned the name Adamski of flying saucer fame. My ears pricked up at this, and I will explain why. I have been reading the visionary journals of my friend Maggie Robertson of late, another exceptionally gifted seer who passed to higher realms a short while ago. Maggie was diagnosed with ME in her early 40s and was no longer able to work. This was when her psychic eye opened, and her vision was clear and pure. Yet she often doubted herself in the beginning. However, she had the occasion to meet with Lady Cynthia Sands, a pure channel for spirit in her own right, who verified everything that Maggie was receiving. Maggie was in her late 80s when she died recently, and she had been receiving information from her 40s to her 80s and was still working just before she died. Wonderful woman. Now, Lady Cynthia Sands was the co-author of the books The Awakening Letters, volumes 1 and 2 that I mentioned last time. Not only that, but her brother-in-law was Adamski, who co-authored a book with Desmond Leslie, Flying Saucers Have Landed. This is the book. In which he wrote about his own personal experiences with the saucer people. Cynthia Sands received communication from Adamski, written of in the second volume, and her daughter Patricia, who passed when young, brought Adamski to speak with her mother. And these were his words. I think this is very relevant considering all the information that we're being told about UFOs, UAPs, whatever you want to call them. But I've had my own experiences with those, and they're certainly not threatening for the ones we've had experience with anyway. Anyway, this is what Patricia said to her mother. I have been having great fun with Adamski. I've brought him here. He was not too keen to come at first, but he was on Earth working in California among the astronomers, and quite glad to leave their shut-in minds. He has been to Jodrell Bank and finds our people much more open to suggestion. He says we need to get more mind training before a real landing is made. He keeps on saying, if only they could get off the ground themselves and use the magnetic currents. If they could reach that stage of development, it would be far easier to impress them with our saucer craft. He says it will come soon, and you will find yourself floating just off the ground. Think of this and try it, and you'll soon begin to get the flying habit. But won't it be amusing? I can see a lot of very funny things happening at first. Now, as soon as I read that, I remembered what my daughter Kate said to me when she was a child. She would come home from school and she would come in and she'd say, Mum, I've just had one of my flutes again. And I'd say to her, what do you mean your floats? And she'd say, well, I was walking home and she said, and I found myself about a foot off the ground. She said, it's a lovely feeling. And it just happens all the time to me. And I put it away in the corner of my mind. And then I read this, that Adamski says, we need to get off the ground. We don't need to leave such a heavy mark. So anyway, I was talking to her the other day and she said to me, I asked her about these and she said, yes, it happens so regularly. And she said, not only when I was walking home, but often when I was sitting in a chair. She said I would just rise up about a foot off the ground. And I thought, yes. And she said I had déjà vus as well, all the time. And then her daughter, who happened to be in the room at the same time, said, I have lots of déjà vus, Grandma. All the time I'm having them. And she was the child who told me, I've got a screen in the back of my mind like a television, she said, and I watch things going on it. And I thought, yes, this child's one of the new children. She's an engineer now. She'll change the world. I'm just here to record what they're telling me. Anyway, that was that. Back to Adamski, who is now speaking to Cynthia. I could tell you a lot of interesting facts about the sources, but you want to contact them. And to do that, you must know within yourself that this is possible and attain to an airborne consciousness. And another thing, when I was working with Margot and we were communicating with the starmen or the extraterrestrials or whatever you want to call them, of course Margot astral travelled. She was airborne. Unfortunately, I can't do it, but never mind, others will. And he said, unless you get this, the knowledge that we can help the sources bring to you will only be interesting phenomena without any scientific link with your state of knowledge and development. I knew so certainly that sources were coming from space, and my faith gave wings to my sight and hearing and to my believing. Faith is a great thing. You have to have it. It is time you got away from the surface right now. You are doing yourselves no good staying on the surface or by flying in planes. But you can, by your own links with us in this form of thought, be able to leave the solid ground and move in the lower ether by your own volition. Is this what Kate was doing in her childhood? He said, I know you call me a crank, and so I am. But you must get started out of this earth rut. Don't you see how much you have trodden into this poor old earth? Now is the time to float over it, to cease from illness, and to get cracking on another line of thought. Oh, I like that fellow at Jodrell Bank. We think alongside each other. But he must go further and further. And this was reference to Sir Bernard Lovell, an English physicist and radio astronomer, and the first director of Jodrell Bank from 1945 to 1980. I see you are all hampered by seldom having perfect health. This means you are only allowing a small intake of light into your bodies. When I say light, I mean this God fabric, which gives and grows and puffs us up like balloons. And unless you can be filled by this Spirit of God, you are ill and heavy in thought and consciousness. It's this last thing that gets me thinking so hard. I just can't figure out how your brains can be speeded up to work faster unless you are healed of all infirmities, great and small, or how to float your mind away from your body. Your mind just can't operate inside your skull. It never could. You must send it out and out into your finer body. You can do this, or I would not be writing about it. I'm working on health sheaths and the force that will carry you off the ground. Not far to start with, but out of contact with the soil, without any metallic instrument between you and the lower ether. I want you to wash your auras in the glorious lower ether and get cracking on some of these more exciting lines of thought and action. And mind you, they are all within your power. And that's what Adamski had to say. I found it very interesting, he said about the perfect health bit. Considering what the world has just been through, that has affected the health of just about everyone on planet Earth, I found his words about the necessity to be healed of all infirmities to be very relevant, because to bring more light, that God stuff, into our bodies, we need to be in perfect health. Cynthia's brother was Sir Alvery Gascoigne, and he was known to her as Joe, and he had this to say: "I met your brother-in-law the other day. He is just as interested as I am in the new movements all over the world. Africa seems to be his baby, while Russia and the East are mine. He was full of ideas about this flying saucer force coming to intervene, but, and this is interesting, needing an invitation from Earth before they could step in. I've not dealt with this at all. I was fascinated to hear that if and when they come, they would bring a new set of ethics with them, that their bodies are more or less allergic to disease, and that the very presence of so much life force will improve the physical health on Earth and make clear, untired thinking possible. That chap Adamski is working with them and has always insisted that a world crippled by illness and weariness could never prosper. So the first thing is health. The second is to eliminate selfishness in just the same way that you would dishonesty. Prosperity and health would draw this nearer to us and then dispel these fatuous ideas of ambition and keeping up with the Joneses. In fact, all the young who are opting out of the rat race are giving their consent to the saucer people. And I asked if it would be an invasion, and he said no, nothing so dramatic. Many would just appear among us, living our sort of lives, but setting a new, formidable standard because they had found happiness within themselves that we, as a race, have not. We are not at ease with ourselves. I recently watched Gabor Mate. Have you seen him? Do you know of him? He was a Holocaust survivor, and he's a psychologist, and he was speaking on the lie that's ruining all our lives. And he said, and this was the gist of why we are not at ease. And he was saying how trauma affects us, and trauma in childhood stays with us throughout our lives. And this is what we have to work with and get rid of. And I found that very interesting because I was reading that and then I listened to him, and that's what he said. We are not at ease within ourselves because of the trauma we have undergone. Well, I mean, we have undergone trauma through everything that's going on. Education, health, God knows what else. Anyway, he continued. Joe, this is Joe speaking. George is going to introduce me to some of these other people who, though in the physical, are far more advanced to see and communicate with us. Far enough advanced to see and communicate with us. It was all very startling and exciting. Please remember this and be ready to welcome the stranger with a new rate of values into your house. It is a most exciting time of transition, both for us and you. George told me how he had met some of these new people in the Sahara. They had landed unseen and made a contact with many of us who were in the etheric, but more or less new arrivals. He was led to them by the waves of force emanating from their machines. They have the power to draw all those who really wish and reach out in thought towards a better understanding with the forces of light. They look like us, but they are much more dynamic, and full of vitality. The ones he met, men and women, fair, with blue eyes, and their shining heads of hair were almost like an aura of gold around them. You felt their composure and complete happiness. That was the only way he could use to describe the sensation they gave him. At once, he said, I felt lifted up into another way of thinking, and everything about them seemed to glow. Not in a dazzling, but in a magnetic way, in which one almost sensed divinity. I asked what happened next. He said, they gave us all instructions on how to prepare areas in which they could make a base. The deserts were obvious places for several reasons, including the sunshine, on which they depended for food. They seemed to live on a strange vegetable diet, which fertilized and grew very rapidly in the sunshine. He said to one of them, You look like the children of the sun. And they answered, That is our mission. I was tremendously impressed by all they told us, and it has already started in a small way in America, where young people have gone out into the wilds to produce food and live simply. He said it would begin there, but many other places would be colonized. Russia, Africa, China among them, and Britain was not to be left out. Our great magnetic centres were to be points of contact. And I found that to be very true when I was working with Margot. Wherever there were standing stones and great magnetic places, and they always asked us to go to high places before they'd communicate, where the air was purer. They said even in Ventnor the air wasn't pure enough. We had to go up into the hills. And it was interesting that he said Russia, because I don't know if you ever came across the Anastasia books by, I think his name was Maigret. Anastasia came out of the wilderness and his name, I can't remember quite his surname, but anyway, she came out of the wilderness and she taught this man who was an entrepreneur. There was 7 or 8 books that he wrote as a result of meeting Anastasia, and she told him about how people would go out into the wilds and have their bit of land and build their own house and grow their own food. And this is happening in Russia, which is lovely to hear, despite all the other rubbish we hear. Joe spoke of his own death, and I thought these words would give great comfort to those who have such a fear of dying. And he said, Death has been made such a bogey that it is only through suffering and discomfort that we are persuaded to let go and cooperate with death. The body fights to retain life on any terms as long as it can. This is the inborn instinct of the body-brain. So we have to re-educate it to accept the hour of passing, the hour when the body-brain will relinquish its power over the body. Over the body it knows, willingly, without waiting for the body to be wrenched away through pain or disease. This teaching is going through on several different waves towards body consciousness, and you will find more and more people will just die in their tracks, which is the ideal way of leaving. But we are all so closely knit together, it is often very hard to drag the spirit body free. I told you I had experienced a strange feeling of power that seemed to be drawing me out of my body during the last few days of my illness. I was so hopelessly ill, and I knew it, that I welcomed this inrush of new life, and let go willingly. That was why I did not linger as many others who longed to hold on to life. And then he's talking to his sister here. And of course she's obviously rather elderly by this time, because he said, "You must all realise now that you've joined the club, the OAPs, that the passing cannot be long delayed, and be ready to receive the power which draws you quite painlessly out of your body. It's the most beautiful and glorious thing. I see so many prolonging life quite unnecessarily. They have finished their task. The mission is ended. If you do this, giving up the reins, as it were, to the great Creator, and expressing your readiness, then life is withdrawn so gently, so lovingly, and the dossier of your earth's effort is closed. All my love, Joe." What a lovely thing to receive from your brother. Well, the synchronicities continued. Once again, catching up on my weekly dose of dark journalist on a Saturday morning, Daniel speaks of Lemuria and the author, James Churchward, whose book, The Lost Continent of Mu, this book here, I read in my teenage years, and it made such an impression when I found it in the library of my hometown of Midhurst in Sussex, the birthplace of my beloved grandmother. More of that later. So, from reading of Churchward's book in the 1950s to a cold December day in the 1980s, I'm driving along the military road towards Freshwater on the Isle of Wight and see a young man hitching a lift. I stop and offer him a ride. We begin chatting, and I realise he's an American, and ask his name and where he's from. All I remember now is my surprise when I heard him say his surname was Churchward. I was stunned at the time and told him I'd only come across that name once before, and that was the author of a book about Lemuria. To my utter astonishment, he replied that James Churchward was his great uncle. Now, what are the chances of that synchronistic happening 30 years apart? So he was invited to spend the night at the Grove, where we were celebrating the birthday of Samantha, one of my young residents at the time. He had an enjoyable evening with all the young people and left the following day. I never saw him again and have never been able to remember his first name. Was that because Churchward was the significance of the connection? It seems that Daniel List has been used as a catalyst for my phone line to the universe of late. But it didn't end there. As you know, these videos are shown on Bill Ryan's Avalon forum, where they have been well received and attract many viewers. One, Lisa Lou, recommended a book she thought I might enjoy after I spoke of my love for King Arthur in the last storytelling. She also shares my passion for this once and future king. The book was Green Darkness by Anya Seton, an author from my own youth, so long ago. I downloaded the ebook on my Kindle, and to my astonishment, it began with names of places I knew so well. Midhurst, Cowdray Ruins, St Anne's Hill, and Esborne, all places where I had spent my happy teenage years. There was also a character who had studied at Guy's Hospital, where I too had been training as a physiotherapist in 1955. Never to finish, am I, Dad? All very bizarre and serendipitous. A short excerpt will suffice to illustrate. It all seemed to begin with a visit to Midhurst last fall. Halloween it was. In the woodland the leaves had turned yellow and russet, and the roads were dappled with fallen leaves and rolling acorns. A smoky violet haze drifted through the folds of the downs, and there was a tang in the air as they set forth to meet their old acquaintances at the Spread Eagle Inn in Midhurst. My goodness, memories flooded into my mind. My maternal grandmother, Sarah Grace Waldridge, known to me as Lala, belonged to the lineage of the Sussex Pescods. She was born in 1877 and grew up in Midhurst, Sussex. I spent all my teenage years there, walking the causeway to the ruins of Cowdray Castle, wandering over the fallen old walls of St Anne's Hill to the woods where the River Rother ran. This was my playground. My grandmother was born above a shop close by the Spread Eagle, and spent the final years of her life in a small flat directly opposite the Spread Eagle. Back home where she belonged, after a very eventful and somewhat sad life. She had come full circle. Serendipity, synchronicity, call it what you will. I call it magic. I've mentioned Margot's guide, John Powell's, in my early stories. And one day in 1979, she received these words from John while I was away in Midhurst. You can help Carolyn where you can by relaying messages for her. She received such comfort from the elderly lady whose name was so strange I could not quite hear, but now I know. She is with me now, and wished her dear grandchild to be aware. This is hard, telling this story. That she wishes her dear grandchild to be aware that she's been with her for the last 4 days and tried to make herself seen, but could not quite manage it while I was in Midhurst. I do not get the Carol in your sister's name, only the Lynn part. This is John Powell speaking. Although my given name is Carolyn, prior to meeting my second husband, I had always been known as Lynn. But he insisted on calling me by my full name, and it has been that way for the last 52 years. Margot never knew me as Lynn. In January 1980, John's words to Margot were, "I told you I would have Carolyn's grandmother speak, and here she is. I hope you can hear her, as I'm afraid her voice may be weak." Thank you. Such a kindly man is helping. And I speak to you, so you can pass this message on to my beloved grandchild. Lynn, my dear, how wonderful to speak like this. I want you to know I am so often with you and your children, two so strong, the other two not so. Now when I passed over, I was surprised at the brightness and the great feeling of peace. It was nothing like I imagined. But there is a very surprising thing I have found out and feel I must tell you, dear. When I was very young, around 16 or 17, I went out for the day and lost the last train home. I sat and cried. I just did not know what to do. An elderly gentleman came to my assistance. He had red hair and had me taken home in a cab at his expense. I never forgot that kindly act, or knew his name. Yet, when I passed over and felt so strange, there he was again to help me. And do you know, Lynn, this man was your friend's great uncle, the one who is writing. This I just had to tell you. So that was Margot's great uncle. And Margot said, I remember him. She said, and he did have red hair. And my grandmother continued, I feel so at peace and enjoy the beautiful gardens with flowers that are far better than I knew on your plain. Oh, Lynn, I wish you could hear me as your friend does. But this is a way I can speak. The man who helps me, and that was John Powell's, says the power is going, but do take care and not overdo the heavy work. I shall be with you a lot, and I also see your sister as well. I will try to speak again. So that was the first communication I received from Lala, my grandmother, but it was not to be the last. On another day, John said, now Carolyn's grandmother is with me and would so like to speak. Only for a moment, I fear, as she will not be allowed longer, but 1 minute is precious to her, like a jewel in Shiva's head. I shall arrange for her to speak from time to time, as she is nearer to Carolyn than her parents are. My dear Lynn, you know who is speaking, as this charming man has practically announced me. I want you to know I am with you so often, and when you were very young, I remember showing you a rainbow, and now I feel I am on that rainbow, sending my voice to your friend, who has such a rare gift. There is danger, though, I see, and all I can say is for some years you have sat in a circle. This is a safe circle of spiritual comfort to those who sit, a man and an elderly woman. This was the circle with Len Stafford and his wife, the retired Methodist minister, who originally told me there is no such thing as coincidence. It is synchronicity. I too seem to have come full circle. And she continued, you have sat often in this circle you now sit in, and this is a circle of spiritual truth and progress. This was with Margot and Wally. But there is a smiling face in a new circle, and this is not good. So I ask you to take care. The rainbow will be our special sign, my dear. And Lynn, remember all I told you. I shall try to speak again, but I'm being drawn away towards a wonderful place beyond any words I have. God bless you. Lalla did speak again when warnings were needed, but I've often wondered about those significant great-uncles in my story. So I now hope you will all be aware of the magical messages of synchronicity in your own lives and take note from now on. I have found they lead me towards more understanding and further knowledge when my oracles are not available. We are all psychic. It is just a matter of finding your own method that will lead you to the Godhead. And remember, when the pupil is ready, the master appears. So open your mind and your heart to the possibility of the magic of synchronicity happening in your lives, and think again on those so-called coincidences when they occur. They are your phone line to the universe. And that is my story for today.